Welcome back to the Black Box, everybody. I'd like to introduce Dr. Michael Hallsworth, the Chief Behavioral Scientist at the Behavioral Insights team. He is a leading figure in applying behavioral science to address practical problems, with over 20 years' experience working as an official and advisor to governments across the world. Today, Dr. Hallsworth will present a practitioner's guide to how behavioral science can and should be done better, drawing on key principles from his Manifesto for Behavioral Science and 4 big shifts for behavioral science. This session will explore how behavioral science can evolve to tackle more significant societal issues beyond just nudges and surface-level interventions, something that was brought up in Her Excellency Shaman Mazroui's remarks yesterday. Dr. Hallsworth, it is a pleasure to have you here. The floor is all yours. You'll be with us shortly.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, distinguished guests, excellencies. It's wonderful to be here with you today at BX 2025. It is a great honor because this is a wonderful conference, and I think a perfect opportunity to talk about the future of behavioral science. And the first thing I want to say about the future of behavioral science is that we're building on a lot of progress. We're building on success that we have seen in the last 15 years. You can see this by the fact that we're holding this conference today from people all around the world. You can see it in the number of units that have been established dedicated to behavioral science from around the world, the resources that have been committed by both the private and public sector to applying these insights in practice. You can see it in the commitment from multilateral organizations, the resources and results that we have that have been tested through rigorous analysis to show that we can make a difference in terms of major societal outcomes. You can see it in terms of the Nobel Prizes awarded, the attention that has been gained from the field. I say all this because I now also want to talk about how things can be better, how we can do more. And I want to start by sort of talking about how we go about behavioral science in the applied settings. And I think it's fair to say that over this 15-year period, there has been a kind of common approach to developing behavioral science interventions. It goes something like this. You look at a particular behavior, you analyze the drivers of that behavior, you develop an intervention, you test the intervention, and you talk about the results. So you might have something like, you're looking at whether people drop litter in a particular space. You say, well, people may not be aware of the waste receptacles, the bins, so we put, say, green footprints to guide them to where they should be going. And then we say, oh, well, there's less litter in the environment. I'm giving a really simplified example here to make the point that this is a linear kind of process that is often used. And I want to also say that this process is really powerful. It means that we can go and say, this is the difference that we made. It generates results. It's been shown over many years to generate results. It also comes from a particular context, I would say. It is trying to respond to the desire to show that we make a difference as behavioral scientists. And I think that's a really important driving force, but I also think that this process that we have developed, and I'm generalizing, as I'll explain later, but this process that is often used, its very strengths may be holding us back. So you have this pressure to demonstrate results and credibility. Many organizations develop this linear process for testing interventions. But because you are focusing on a particular behavior, so you try and say, we change this thing, that means that you are almost by definition looking at some of the more downstream specific aspects. Because it's very hard to test a whole system. It's hard to test the entire tax system. We change it, we can't have a clear counterfactual of how the behavioral science element made a difference. And that means that we then go and present our results. And we say, this is the difference we made. We changed this thing. People look at that and they say, OK, that's interesting. That is what behavioral scientists do. If I want to change a particular thing, an aspect of the environment, I will go to a behavioral scientist. For the other stuff, for the big policy questions, maybe I'll stick with the economists or whoever I normally go to. It's not a behavioral science thing. That is completely wrong, I would say, as an attitude. And it's not completely widespread. It's been changing. But I think we also need to change our practices to change those perceptions. Take the example of litter. It is not just whether you drop a piece of litter in a particular context. It is, what are the generators of waste in the first place? Why do people have packaging that needs to be disposed of? And that is a problem or an issue that goes beyond the specific context. I think this, I was actually listening to the opening talk from Her Excellency Minister Shama Al-Mazrui yesterday, and I think she made a really great point in this regard, that you need to think about sustainable change in the wider context. And I think behavioral science can do that. We have done this as a team a bit many times. We looked in the Solomon Islands, for example, at the system, the various contributors that led to there being plastic waste in for school lunches. And we looked at how you needed to make several changes with different actors to lead to substitutes so that you had fewer non-disposable waste receptacles. You try and make a change that can only happen through multiple points of intervention. And that's what I want to talk about today. So I have in the past presented some ideas, some proposals about the future of behavioral science in this kind of manifesto. But today, I actually want to give you some new things. I want to be thinking about these 4 big shifts for behavioral science. And I think this is trying to be more practical in terms of what can we actually do as practitioners. And the first one is building on what I just said in terms of working with complexity and systems. So if you take what appears to be a single decision, this is some work we did around the question of when is someone discharged from a hospital. This is a really important decision. It has knock-on effects throughout the whole hospital system. If the bed is freed up, it allows a whole other series of decisions to be made to use resources effectively. But as you may have guessed, this is not a single decision made by one person. If you look at it that way, you are not going to address the problem. Instead, we mapped the system, the various interactions, the forces and decisions that influenced that single decision to discharge or not someone from hospital. What this allows you to do is to focus on particular aspects, particular areas where you get the bottlenecks, where you can have the biggest impact by making a targeted change. Now, that is different from making a targeted change without considering the wider context. You're understanding that if we change here, we are likely to have a bigger effect. And that's exactly what we did by focusing on a few factors which were importantly connected to other factors. Now, you may be looking at how to achieve a particular outcome for the system, a particular decision, but you may also be thinking about how can we spread change more widely throughout a society, a system. And we know that rather than having a simple model of we are behavioral scientists and we influence people, people influence each other all the time in social networks. People are outside talking to each other, doing exactly that. So if you think about then, the obvious question becomes, who should you try to appeal to or target in the system to have maximum impact, to have maximum spread of behaviors? And this is an empirical question. We can test this, and it has been tested. So you can think about some possible options here. You could choose people randomly. I go to you, and I say, please, I convince you to adopt a particular behavior. Or I might say, well, I try and map everyone's relationships, and I find the structurally important individuals, much like we mapped the system in the hospital. And we go to those people and we say, we make the case for adopting behavior, and hopefully other people will see that. And there is another option which is kind of interesting, which combines the two. We go to people randomly, and we say, who are your friends? Who are the people you listen to? And we target those people. And as I mentioned, you can empirically test this. This was done in Honduras, and they took different villages, hundreds of them, and they either put them in one of 3 camps where they adopted those approaches. And you can see their results suggested that actually the approach where you randomly select people and ask them to nominate their friends was they found the most effective at spreading this behavior of multivitamin usage. Okay? So I think this kind of question is really a fascinating and important one for the future of behavioral science, looking at the dynamics of systems and empirically testing how we can have the greatest impact. Second thing to focus on, complexity in systems, but also the social drivers of behavior. I'm going to make a claim, it's a general one, that a lot of the way that we perhaps have thought about behavioral science, maybe particularly 10 years ago, is very much focused on, biases, perhaps the way people think, often focused on individuals. How does this individual take in information and make a decision? I'm going to return to litter. Now, if you think about this, one very famous explanation of litter from behavioral science is Robert Cialdini's explanation of social norms. So it goes something like this. If you go to an environment and you see many pieces of litter on the ground, you infer a descriptive social norm. Many people are doing it, so it's okay. So I'm more licensed to drop litter. On the other hand, he says, if you see just one piece of litter and nothing else, it has the opposite effect, because you think, no, look, your attention is drawn to the piece of litter. No one else is doing that. That's wrong. I shouldn't do that. Okay, so that's really interesting. However, as I mentioned, this is a very kind of, I suppose, individualistic and cognitive way of thinking about behavior. You're an individual and you take in data. Cialdini refers to it as an information processing shortcut, okay? But I think we need to think more broadly about the kinds of ways we make decisions, the kind of information we pay attention to. So we also need to think about not just assuming that people will think, not many people are doing that, therefore I won't do it, but understand the knowledge or expectations that people have about others in their societies. What do we think others will do in the same situation? It may vary. So, for example, you may have a world in which, just imagine this, you are okay to drop litter because you know that someone else will pick it up because you pick up other people's litter. Right? That sounds strange, but it could be an accepted norm that you just pick up other people's litter. Therefore, if you go along and you think, we must target the person who is seeing this and assume that we know what they're thinking, you will get the wrong diagnosis of the issue. We need to understand how that may vary from society to society, those expectations people have of others. It'll look good to you as an intervention, but it will fail to work. You need to understand the knowledge we have about others, often implicit in societies, expectations. Knowledge is one thing. Social values as well is also really important. It is not the case, as implied in that study, that you are just a sort of atomized individual observing something. You are a person embedded in a society. You have a role, you have expectations of others, you judge other people in different ways. If some person dropping litter is a local resident, a visitor, an authority figure, you will have a different reaction to them. Various studies have shown that this is true. It's not just a contextless person interpreting things. So we need to, as behavioral scientists, understand how do values, identity, and context interact. In some contexts, littering might be seen as a protest. In other contexts, it may be seen as a symptom of community disconnection. That is much broader and important than just saying people see things and they make a decision, they make a shortcut based on a mental interpretation of behavior. And then finally, how do we even understand what litter is in the first place, for example? What are the social processes that lead us to see certain things in certain categories? If you place a piano in the park rather than a water bottle, people might see that as socially beneficial thing. You're giving people the opportunity to make music for others. Yet if you put a broken piano, or indeed if after a few weeks the piano is ruined, it becomes litter in people's minds. But these categories are formed by our perceptions and so on. And so you need to go back and say, well, how are people even understanding the problem in the first place? And is my perception as a behavioral scientist inaccurate? Because it might be. And that's why I want to leave this final, this proposal, which is that I think behavioral scientists can help understand how these cultures, these mental models that we see, through which we see the world, influence behavior, how they are shaped, how culture and cognition are related. I think we're really well placed to do that. We talk about universal cognitive processes. These are shaped by our individual environments. Third proposal, getting more flexible and adaptive. And this is where I want to go back to the idea of a linear process where you define a problem, diagnose it, and then you move on to the solution. Let me give you some thoughts here. Suppose you're in a world in which a country that has a tax credit for being married, and a tax official comes to you and says, well, I don't understand it. We've been trying to get people who are engaged or about to get married to apply for this tax credit, but no one's doing it. It's free money. Why are they not doing it? This tax official may be seeing this as a tax problem, but you consider a different frame on the issue, that people maybe in the world where they're spending money for the wedding and so on. They're not in a domain of thinking about savings, and indeed they may not even want to appear like one of the factors for getting married is this financial benefit. The tax official is seeing it from a tax perspective. There are other frames available. The failure to break out of your perspective and frame means we may misdiagnose the issue. You can see this also at a corporate level, for example. You can see how your frame that was once really effective becomes misaligned over time. And that's what happened with the Kodak film company. It actually invented the digital camera in 1975. It didn't do anything with this discovery because it conceived of itself as a company that works with film, that prints things. By 2012, it went bankrupt because people didn't want to print things anymore. If it had changed the frame as an image creation company, it would have survived. So you can see where your perspective is limited from the start, or it becomes misaligned over time. So behavioral science is both a victim of these things and also can help us think how these are framing issues. And I propose we should be thinking about a flexible framing approach. So rather than a process where we move from a fixed diagnosis, a particular frame, to the optimized solution based on that frame, I think we should be in a space where we think about possible frames, potential solutions, and have an iterative process. Let me take you back to litter again. So you might think, we're dealing with litter in a particular situation. How do we deal with it with a different frame? If it were on a beach, if it were at a music festival, if this was an issue about safety, if this, in other words, people tripping over litter, if it was an issue about civic responsibility, if it was an issue about the environment. These are different frames on an issue which naturally leads you to different potential solutions. It isn't that you then take that solution, but you try them out, you prototype them, and then it feeds back into other potential frames on the issue. And this is often called frame innovation. It's thought about a period in which the problem and the solution spaces are unstable. They inform each other, it is not defined, and then an optimal solution. People talk about both of these things developing together through multiple rounds called co-evolution. It's a bit like prototyping. If you come up with something that's not perfect, you try it, you look at the advantages it brings, and you revise it later. So this is the idea that we perhaps need to be reassessing our ideal of the goal to see maybe we need to see things differently. And let me tell you personally, many of the most successful projects that I have worked on over the last 15 years involved some revision of the problem as presented. That was almost the most creative or the most value-adding part of it. This is not just something I think should be optional. I think we should be working on this as standard. But let me be honest with you, it's often hard, because you are often presented with a fixed problem which you then have to solve as a behavioral scientist. So we also need to be working with clients to see how can they see a different view of a behavioral scientist, not as technical experts fixing a problem that has been defined, but maybe people who work with the clients to work out what is the problem and how can we redefine it. There's some other ways you can do this, prompting alternative frames early in a project, maybe by including designers in the team, encouraging different groups in the problem definition stage, because they can bring radically different frames to the issue. And as I mentioned, we maybe need to think less as technicians and more about shaping the nature of the frame with the client. Which takes me on to my final proposal around boosting participation. Again, the generalization, the caricature might be that behavioral science has been maybe a somewhat top-down approach. We have experts who define a problem and then implement a solution. That's not always, that's been a caricature. Behavioral science has involved participation much more than is tended to be thought, but I think we can go further as well. It's not just a case of can we get input to improve our solutions or to check or to consult with people. Deliberative spaces, the way that people talk to each other about an issue, can change behavior themselves. They are, if you like, an intervention. We can see this, the work we did for Meta, where we actually ran the largest online community forum, actually the largest community forum, I believe, 6,500 participants, 32 countries, dealing with issues that had no clear answer, that were contested around AI, around the metaverse, and so on. And what we saw, we were surprised, actually. We were surprised with how civil and how constructive these discussions were, partly because of the way that they were set up, and I'll come on to that in a second, but also because people came out of this feeling like they had a different understanding of what an online exchange could be. It may be actually that AI mediators are even more effective than humans at reducing division, at structuring these interactions. I've seen a paper that just came out to suggest that that is the case, because you remove some of the human judgment element in terms of people feeling like you don't inject more emotion into the debate. So I think that behavioral scientists can help finding new ways of helping people engage in the deliberation. We know that if you ask many people in many countries, they express some willingness to do this kind of thing, but there's no real opportunity. If we see it not just as a tick box, but as a way of changing behavior itself, I think we could think more about this. Second challenge, we often think about experts developing interventions, but there is some evidence that co-designed interventions can be more effective. It's not just, oh, let's get some people's views and then we'll feel like we did our duty. There's evidence, for example, that there was a large experiment with a bank that showed that the crowdsourced experiments, crowdsourced messages, were actually more effective than the expert-generated ones at getting people to open a message about the bank's subscription management tool. Because there is some insight into the position you're in as a customer. And I think that, in fact, the best way may be combining expert opinion and peer opinion. There's some evidence that in exercise interventions, for example, the expert-generated messages were best for people at the early stages of starting to exercise, and the peer-generated ones were most effective at encouraging them to continue. This is a really interesting frontier that I think we should explore more, and we're being hampered by thinking there must be an expert opinion to develop an intervention. And then finally, in terms of participation, well, I mentioned that the interactions may themselves be, the participatory element may be the intervention. Well, if that's true, then there are millions of people already working with AI on their own to create new interventions, shaping their own behavior. And I think behavioral scientists have a role of understanding, and we heard yesterday some fantastic inputs on the interactions between human and AI. Can we shape the way that these systems are set up? Can we give empirical data about how people are interacting, the consequences of these interactions, both in terms of your individual psychology, but also the wider effect on society? Because this kind of participation is happening already all around the world, and we need to we can and should understand it better. 4 big shifts: more capable of working with complexity and at the level of systems, more attentive to the social drivers, the social dimension of behavior, more flexible and adaptive, so we're not just focusing on a fixed diagnosis and then solving for that, and more participatory, not just as a tick box, but as saying this is something that can really elevate our own practice as behavioral scientists. If you want to read more detail about this, please do so. These blogs, the 4 big shifts, were published online. I want to thank you for your time today. I've really enjoyed talking about this, and I hope we can put some of this into practice as behavioral scientists. Thank you again.
Dr. Hallsworth, thank you so much for your fascinating insights and for sharing those fascinating insights with us today. Systems design and systems thinking is actually one of the things that I am personally very passionate about, so it's awesome that he brought that in his session. The next session in the black box will take place in 30 minutes at 12:30 with a presentation from Professor Eric Johnson on the role of choice architecture in how we make decisions. Hope to see you here.